Hello, this is Sayus, and today we want to talk about My Hero Academia up to chapter 303. Not so much about the chapter specifically, but of the entire journey. In this case, I want to talk about Shoto. Last video, I talked a lot about Endeavor, I talked a lot about Toya, so now it's Shoto's turn. Because I don't talk about Endeavor, I will now draw an Endeavor without a reference, because I'm too lazy to look one up. Anyway, so yeah, enjoy. I've already mentioned last chapter that the scene with Shoto reaching out for Endeavor, telling him, when you're done grieving, stand back up, we have to stop Toya together, was one of my favorite Shoto scenes so far. I really loved this scene because it shows his emotional maturity. But more so this chapter, and I've recently also read an essay on the Todoroki family which helped me come to this understanding. This chapter I've come to understand that I actually really like Shoto. So these two chapters, 302, 303, helped me gain really a newfound appreciation for Shoto, which is maybe a bit surprising because Shoto, although he was present in the chapters, and although he is of course important in these flashbacks, the flashbacks weren't about him. This was about Toya, it was about Enji's slow decline, and it was about meeting Rei for the first time, getting to know her a little bit better, because we don't really know that much about her prior to this flashback. Shoto himself is there. He's always there in the flashbacks, and he, of course, plays an important role in both Toya's and Enji's, and even Rei's decline. But he himself doesn't really do much, since he's a kid. We don't really learn anything new about Shoto in these flashbacks. After, during the entire hospital scenes, Shoto himself is also not the person who does the most. The most active moment is the one that I just mentioned, where he stands in front of Endeavor and tells him to stand back up. So although Shoto didn't actually do that much during these chapters, I've found a new appreciation for his character. Before I talk about how I think about Shoto now, maybe I should start telling you guys how I thought about Shoto before. Now, Shoto, before these chapters, was a character that I was kind of indifferent on. I didn't particularly like him, but I also didn't dislike him. There was nothing about Shoto that I didn't like, but the way he emotes, which is very subtle, very cool, the way he acts, which is most of the time he isn't the one with a big focus on him, he isn't the one with the big moments, he isn't the one with the big fights, he's more so watching what's going on around him and forming his own opinions. We rarely get to know what he thinks because he doesn't emote openly, which means unless he tells us what he's thinking, we don't know. And for the most part, he's watching other characters. We see him watch Bakugo, we see him watch Midoriya, we see him watch his father. He's not so much doing things himself. Which meant that for me, whenever I thought about Shoto, I always had the problem that, although I didn't dislike him, there was not a particular moment that I remembered where I thought this was a really great Shoto moment. The best Shoto moment in my memory was always Sports Festival, his fight with Deku. That was a great moment. But after that, it seems like he's always there. He's always doing things in the background, but he's never quite the main focus of the story. So I often felt that in school, characters like Bakugo or Midoriya stole the show, while even during the family scenes, which are ultimately about Shoto, other characters stole the show, like, of course, Natsuo and Fuyumi whenever they were there, because I just liked them so much immediately the moment they appeared. And of course, Endeavor is my favorite character, so whenever he's there, I barely even think about Shoto. Of course, I like Shoto and Endeavor to interact, and I like these scenes, but I like them because of Endeavor and never so much because of Shoto, because Shoto never did this much in these scenes. He was always watching. And when I say watching, I don't just mean Endeavor. I know that I've few videos ago, my very first video, talked about how Endeavor is the one who always wants people to watch him, and now when I say Shoto is watching people, of course I also mean he's watching Endeavor, but he's also watching the other members of his family. We can see in Endeavor Agency arc that he is watching Natsuo, he's watching Fuyumi, he's watching his siblings and looking how they interact, how they deal with the situation, and whether they can heal with their way. And this is always something that I now that I look back, and it is a very smart move by him, and it shows that he is trying to find the best way, and he's trying to understand every member of his family. But it also means that for the most part, whenever he was in the scene, he wasn't the main focus of the scene. Funnily enough, that rule still counts. Even in these 3 chapters, he wasn't the main focus. As I mentioned before, the focus was very much on Toya, very much on Enji. The whole hospital scene itself, not the flashback, is very much focused on Rei, because it's the first time she gets to interact and gets to tell her story, and she gets to show that she is now in power in a way, that she has the strength to move forward and carry her family with her, while everybody else doesn't really know how to move on from the revelation that Toya is alive. And still now, I really, really like him. Why is that? Why did my opinion change, even though Shoto's way of acting didn't really change? I think the answer is very simple, and that is that I finally understood that. I always thought Shoto was kinda boring, and now I understand why he is the way he is. At this point, I want to move a step away from Shoto and first take a glance on how Horikoshi handled the entire Todoroki family business so far. How, especially the children, but also Rei, handle the abuse now that it is somewhat over. Because as far as we can tell, Endeavor has now stopped abusing his family, and now the question is, how do these people that are not actively abused anymore get to heal? What ways do they choose, and how do they move on from what happened to them? And Horikoshi gives us these 4 characters, Fuyumi, Natsuo, Shoto, and Rei, and now the 5th character in Toya, who all have chosen different paths to move forward after the abuse happened. Rei in Pro Hero arc seemed to be on a way where she focused very much on trying to get her own life back in order, trying to get back into contact with her children, who all to varying degrees had lost contact with her for a certain amount of time, and she couldn't raise because she was stuck in hospital. Her story was always about getting out of hospital, moving on with life. But overall, her story is very much about accepting her own responsibilities, however small they are in comparison to Enji, about trying to move on with life, about trying to get out of hospital, about trying to do these things independently of Enji, but now also on top of that, she is trying to be sort of a leading figure now that Enji is in an almost in a position where he's willing to give up. Now Rei steps forward and wants to basically take the reins of the family. So Rei's story is very much a story about emancipation from Enji and also proving her power in the family, finally taking on a leadership role again, but also a story of regret and guilt that she still feels for the loss of her child, because ultimately her change, ultimately her healing, her moving on, her trying to become stronger and trying to take the reins, it all comes too late to both help her son that is dead and now, or was supposed to be dead and is now a villain, or help any of the other children who are now all adults apart from Shoto, or help Shoto, who she hurt herself because she was too apathetic. So it's a story of regret. I don't blame her for waiting for so long. It's something where she blames herself. She regrets this. She feels guilty for it. So it's easy to say that Rei's story now is one of emancipation, but now is 10 years after she last saw Enji. In all these 10 years before, and even while she was with Enji, we now learn, her story was one of apathy, of accepting what happened, of being almost fatalistic and just assuming that there was nothing she could do to stop it, of not even trying to stop anything. And this sort of acceptance is, I assume, a way to deal with abuse. These almost petrifying state of not doing anything is a perfectly normal and I would assume in most cases acceptable way to react to being abused. And this is something we can see with all of the Todoroki children as well, that I will talk to now, that all of these ways that the children and Rei choose to cope are very realistic ways somebody will cope. Fumi became in a way, the peacekeeper in the family, especially when Endeavor changed a little bit. She started hoping that maybe she has a chance at the family. She tried to bring the family together. But what she did, as she tried to harmonize the different members of the family, try to create this harmony and peace, was that she ignored many of the aspects that made her goal ultimately impossible. She knew that, of course, for example, Natsuo didn't want to be with Enji in the same room, but she hoped that he would be willing to do it regardless for this sake of the family that she tried to create out of essentially nothing. Therefore, in a way, her goal was doomed from the start, because although she tried very hard to bring her family together, there were aspects within these different relationships that made her goal impossible and that she just tried to ignore, hoping it would work out regardless. Natsuo's way of coping is in a way the exact opposite to Fuyumi's. He decided that to deal with the abuse, he had to cut off his father. He moved on to live on college campus, to live his own life. And even when Fuyumi tried to bring the family together and tried to make them interact, every time they met, Enji and Natsuo would end up fighting. Because Natsuo doesn't want to give his father forgiveness, he doesn't want to give him a chance, and he doesn't want to even agree that his father is willing to change. To him, this is all just a farce that ultimately will maybe go wrong and then he will just be hurt more. Now, Natsuo has reached a sort of understanding where he accepts some responsibility for himself, but he still isn't willing to forgive his father, nor include him in his life, nor give him a second chance. He's willing to work with him now until they stop Toya, and that's that. After that, he doesn't want to see his father ever again, as far as I understand. Now, before I go to Shoto, let's go to the outer extreme of resentment against his father, and there we have Toya. Toya absolutely hates Endeavor. Toya has been away from his father for 10 years, almost as long as Rei was away from her husband, and he has decided to become a villain to eventually get the sort of attention that he needed to bring his father's abuse to the public, to bring Endeavor down and to destroy his career, his life. He's willing to go so far as to hurt his own siblings in the process. He resents Shoto, and he is now a villain. He's a terrorist, a murderer, an arson, and he did all that for the explicit purpose of bringing his abuser not necessarily to justice, but to destroy his abuser's life. Now, Shoto actually started out with a similar mindset than Toya, just far less extreme, and that was that he wanted to hurt his father, and Shoto thought he could do this by becoming the strongest hero without using his father's quirk. He became very angry, he pushed people away, he isolated himself in his class, all in the obsession to find a way to make his father hurt by becoming this strong hero without using his quirk. This was the way he came up with to destroy Endeavor. In Sports Festival, of course, Midoriya then told him that the quirk is his own. Ultimately, it is all about what Shoto himself chooses to do with it. And that by restricting himself from using his own quirk to its maximum potential, ultimately he hurts himself more than he does Endeavor. Since then, Shoto has slowly warmed up to the idea that his father might be willing to change. He wasn't very open to it in the very beginning, in the remedial course arc, when Endeavor first told him that he planned to change. But since then, since Pro Hero and then with Endeavor Agency, he's increasingly given his father chances to prove that he actually meant it. He was willing to watch Endeavor the way Endeavor wanted him to see that Endeavor actually meant his attempt at change. So here we have 5 different ways of dealing with abuse. We have race, apathy that then leads to finally having to prove and to prove herself and to become stronger and finally taking the reins after not doing that for so many years. We have Yumi, who has chosen to reach out for her father and to try to harmonize the family, but has also very much ignored problems that are there and that would make her goal difficult to achieve. We have Natsuo, who feels resentment and is cutting his father out of his life. We have Toya, who utterly hates his father and is on a revenge plot in a way. And then we have Shoto, who is open to the idea that his father might be changing, who is willing to watch his father and to give him this chance, but who doesn't reach out to him, who doesn't make it easy for him. Horikoshi has, for the most part, shown these different ways of dealing with the abuse, of moving on after the abuse happened, equally fair. All of these characters were able to decide themselves how they wanted to deal with Endeavor. Enji didn't force them to do anything, nor did he expect anything from them, nor did any of the other characters comment that their ways of dealing with abuse was wrong or right, or better or worse than somebody else's method of dealing with the abuse. However, there were two instances where we actually got to learn that a character was wrong. The first is when in Sports Festival, Midoriya told Shoto that the quirk is his own. In this sense, Midoriya told Shoto that his way of dealing with the abuse was wrong. When Shoto tried to hurt his father by restricting his own usage of his quirk, he wasn't correct. He wasn't making the right decision. He wasn't making the healthy decision. It might have been an understandable decision, but ultimately all Shoto did was hurt himself further, restrict his chances at becoming a great hero. He let his father hurt him even more, even in a way through his own actions. Shoto, by trying to hurt his father, ultimately ended up only hurting himself. That is something Midoriya realized and told him. So Shoto's way of dealing with the abuse was ultimately the wrong way to do it. Not because it wasn't understandable, not because it wasn't maybe justified, but because it hurt himself more than it did Endeavor. Now the second instance is similarly Midoriya, this time telling Toya that he is wrong. It is a very similar situation where Midoriya tells Toya that his quirk is not Endeavor's. However, even after we have dealt with these different characters for so long, and we haven't judged their methods of coping with abuse on a scale from good to bad ways of dealing with abuse, this chapter we suddenly change trajectory, because this chapter suddenly in comes a character and tells Shoto specifically that his way of dealing with the abuse is admirable. Last chapter, Rei comes in and picks out Shoto specifically. Both Rei and Hawks, both victims of abuse themselves, both victims of abuse who have chosen their own ways of coping, are now looking at Shoto and admiring his way of dealing with his abuse. They both think that he's incredible, that what he's doing is amazing, and both in a way maybe feel regret. Hawks outright expressed this. Both feel regret that they didn't do this, that they chose their own way, which they now think was maybe the worst way of dealing with the abuse. And this is maybe the reason why I finally understood that I actually really like Shoto. Because this chapter, through the eyes of Hawks, through the eyes of Rei, this chapter made it clear to me that how Shoto deals with his very difficult situation, how Shoto deals with abuse is amazing. This is a young kid, he's 15, now 16 years old, just turned 16, and he's dealing with a very difficult situation, and he does it amazingly. In fact, what I just learned is that what I finally understood is that Shoto is doing exactly what I have always criticized Dabi for not doing. Shoto and Dabi, in a way, both start the story in a similar position. Toya, of course, more extreme than Shoto. But both start in a position where they want revenge, where they want to hurt the abuser. Both also inevitably, by going this journey of revenge, end up hurting themselves much more than they hurt the abuser. And Midoriya tells both of them that their flames are their own, their quirks are their own, he does not only mean that they shall feel comfortable with their quirk, that they should be able to use it without always thinking about their father and the abuse, because it is part of their body and ultimately they should be able to accept their own body. But also what this means is that whatever they do with their quirks is ultimately their own choice and their own responsibility. Shoto thought by not using his quirk he could punish his father, but he also thought this was his father's fault. His father was his fault for traumatizing him so much that he isn't willing to use his quirk. Of course there's a certain logic for that, but ultimately it's a decision that Shoto makes himself. It's a decision that Shoto has to take full responsibility for himself. Similarly, the decisions he makes, which make his life early on in UA difficult, for example, isolating himself from his fellow students, for example, the way he treats Inasa, these are all things that he might have blamed on his father, he might have been angry at his father when he acted that way, but ultimately these are his own responsibility. The abuse he suffered from his father and how that affected him is not his responsibility, but how he acts from now on, that is his full responsibility. What he uses quirk for, that's his own responsibility. So to finally move on from the abuse, he has to be able to make these decisions himself. This is an aspect that permeates Shoto's entire character arc. Even during the Hosu arc, while Endeavor was still abusive and still didn't see the error of his ways, even then he was willing to go to the Endeavor agency to get an internship, and that was because he realized if he wants to be a great hero, going to Endeavor for an internship would be the smartest decision. And if he doesn't make this decision, then not being able to learn from Endeavor would be a loss for him. It would be something where he suffered by letting his fear of Endeavor or his hatred for Endeavor rule his life. And ultimately, as long as you still let the fear for your abuser or the hatred for your abuser rule your life, inevitably your abuser still rules your life. Even as a victim of abuse, especially if you reach a certain age, the decisions you make are your own, and the consequences are the one you are responsible for. And this is something that I think Shoto understood when he fought Midoriya, that as long as he lets his hatred for his father rule his life, and this is something he himself has control over, that long he is still in a victim position, that long he still lets his father ruin his life, but even more so because his father isn't actually doing anything anymore, because it is his decision to let the hatred rule his life. It's his responsibility. So saying, I'm going to do this because my father abused me in the past, is just a lame excuse at this point, because his father does not force him to do this. He is the one who takes active responsibility for his own life. And it's funny that I never noticed this, because it is in a way exactly the opposite to what I was always annoyed at when I thought about Toya/Darby. Because Darby doesn't do that. Darby is now 10 years removed from the abuse and removed from Enji. Darby had time to move on. Darby had time to make his own decisions, yet he didn't. He still lets his hatred for Endeavor rule his life to the point where now he's a villain, he's a murderer, and he's an arson, all because he wants to destroy his father. But these are all decisions that Darby made himself. However often he tries to tell on national TV that his flames are Endeavor's flames, as often as he yells at Enji and tells him that the abuse is the cause for creating Darby, ultimately these were all decisions that Darby made while being already out of the influence of Enji. These are all decisions that he is responsible for himself because he's a responsible adult. That he knew that attacking Shoto was wrong all the way back when he was 13, and still now he still wants to kill him just to hurt his father. He knows killing these 30 innocent people is wrong, but he did it regardless, even though he knew it was wrong, to hurt his father. However, his father did not force him to make these decisions. These were all Darby's own decisions. Darby may act as if his quest for revenge for hatred, bringing Enji down and destroying him, is his final act of emancipation. Darby may also think that Shoto, who is still standing next to Endeavor and working with him, is therefore more under Endeavor's control and still just Endeavor's masterpiece. But really, Shoto has taken several steps ahead of Toya in dealing with and moving on from the abuse. Shoto has healed far better and far more effectively than Toya, who is still in a process, let's be honest, damaging himself more than Enji, still letting his abuser rule his life. I've been talking to quite a few people about whether or not Toya seems to take responsibility, and from watching him, I still believe that Toya is absolutely not doing that. Toya acts like everything he does is because of Enji, and therefore also Enji's fault. Of course he knows that Enji is not the one who's actually killing his victims. Of course he knows that. Of course he knows that this is his quirk that he is using himself. But he also still blames everything he does on Endeavor. And this blame is, even though this is maybe counterintuitive to what we feel because he is the victim of abuse, this blame is misplaced. This is something that Shoto has understood. And thinking about it and how I could not necessarily ignore it, because I guess I knew it, but I didn't really actively become aware of it until recently. This is why I actually really like Shoto now, because Shoto is mature. Not just emotionally mature in a way that he is able to understand his father and where he comes from and is willing to reach out to his father, but also himself mature in being able to take control over his own life. So we're now reaching the end of this video. I haven't talked this much about the actual chapter 303. I really like the chapter. I wanted to talk more so about this particular scene with Hawks telling Shoto that he's really amazing, which I now have to agree. I often place Shoto on the low end of the Todoroki family in terms of how much I like, just because I enjoyed Natsuo's tantrums so much and because Fumi is just so precious. But ultimately, I really think that looking at Shoto's overall journey, it's an amazing journey that is he deserves all the respect for that. And I'm now willing to acknowledge that. I don't think I have said the word responsibility quite that often in just half an hour ever in my life. And now that I think about it, it might be that the reason for that is that the whole quest of the Todoroki family arc is not just to explore abuse, but also to explore responsibility. The question of the responsibility of the abuser, which is of course always one we can easily answer because the abuser is the one who is acting wrong. Maybe more interesting is the question of the responsibility of the victim, not so much the responsibility of the victim for the abuse they suffered, which they of course are not responsible for, but how they then move on from that, how to live after the abuse. So I want to leave you at that. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope my drawing turns out alright, because I don't want to embarrass myself. Talk to me in the comments about what you think about Shoto's character, because I think it's actually amazing.